The dust devil had been chasing Samuel Lonely Rancher McKenna for the better part of an hour, swirling red Arizona dirt into his eyes and coating his black gelding's flanks with grit. At 43, Sam had learned to read the desert's moods like scripture: when to push through, when to shelter, when to trust his horse's instincts over his own stubborn will. Today felt different, though. The wind carried something more than sand and sage. He'd been riding the boundary of his modest spread, checking fence lines after yesterday's storm, when the squall hit. Nothing unusual about that. September in Tombstone territory could serve up weather meaner than a rattlesnake with a toothache. But as the wind died and the dust settled, Sam heard it, a rhythmic tapping echoing from somewhere beneath the earth. 3 sharp strikes, then silence. A pause. 2 more strikes. The sound drew him toward the old Red Rock Consolidated mine shaft, abandoned since the silver played out 2 years back. Most folks avoided the place. Too many cave-ins, too many men who'd gone down and never come back up. But Sam had always been drawn to forgotten places, maybe because he understood what it meant to be overlooked. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." His gelding, Jasper, snorted and shied away from the shaft opening. Smart horse. The timber frame around the entrance sagged like broken ribs, and loose rocks scattered down into the darkness with every gust of wind. Sam dismounted, ground tying Jasper well back from the unstable edge. The tapping came again, deliberate, desperate. "Hello down there," Sam called, his voice echoing off stone walls. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it made his skin crawl. Then, faintly, came a voice, high, thin, barely human. "Help, please." Sam's blood turned to ice water. He'd heard plenty of stories about miners trapped in cave-ins, their voices carrying through rock and timber for days before the silence took them. But this voice belonged to a child. Without hesitation, Sam grabbed his rope from Jasper's saddle and secured it around a sturdy pine growing near the shaft. The tree had weathered decades of desert storms. It would hold his weight and then some. He wrapped the rope around his waist, lit his oil lantern, and began the treacherous descent into the Red Rock mine. The shaft dropped straight down for about 30 feet before angling off into a horizontal drift. Sam's boots found purchase on rotting timber supports and jutting rocks, each step sending small avalanches of debris into the depths below. The air grew thick and stale, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something that made his stomach turn. Fear, the smell of pure, concentrated terror. His lantern light finally reached the bottom of the shaft, illuminating a scene that would haunt Sam's dreams for years to come. Huddled against the far wall of a small chamber, barely visible in the flickering yellow glow, sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His wrists were raw and bleeding, secured to a heavy timber brace by iron shackles that looked like they'd been forged in hell itself. The child's clothes, what remained of them, were little more than rags. His face was streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Around his neck hung a bent brass tag, the kind the mining companies use to identify their workers. But this was no worker. This was a baby, thrown into darkness and forgotten. "Easy there, son," Sam said softly, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I'm here to help. What's your name?" The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. He'd probably been screaming for help until his voice gave out. Sam knelt beside him, examining the shackles. They were old but solid, secured with a heavy padlock that would require more than brute strength to break. "Hold still now," Sam murmured, pulling a small crowbar from his belt. He'd learned long ago that a cattleman needed to be part blacksmith, part carpenter, and part miracle worker. Today, he'd need to be all 3. The first shackle took 10 minutes of careful prying before the metal finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber. The boy whimpered as blood rushed back into his hands, and Sam could see the deep grooves the iron had carved into young flesh. "That's one," Sam said, moving to the second shackle. "We'll have you out of here in no time." As he worked, Sam noticed details that made his anger burn hotter than his lantern flame. The boy's brass tag bore the number 247 and the letters RRC, Red Rock Consolidated. But more disturbing were the other signs of long-term imprisonment. A filthy blanket in one corner, a tin cup beside a small puddle of stagnant water, and scratch marks on the walls where small fingers had tried to claw their way to freedom. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. The second shackle proved more stubborn, but Sam's fury gave him strength. When it finally snapped, the boy collapsed forward into his arms, sobbing with relief. Sam wrapped him in his own coat, feeling how thin and fragile the child had become. "What's your name, son?" Sam asked again, his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. The boy looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. Tommy Brennan." "Well, Tommy Brennan, we're getting out of here right now." Sam lifted the boy carefully, surprised by how little he weighed. "Can you hold on tight? We've got a bit of climbing to do." Tommy nodded, wrapping his thin arms around Sam's neck with desperate strength. Sam secured the rope around both of them and began the slow ascent back to daylight. Each step was agony, not from the physical effort, but from the knowledge that someone had put this child in that hole and left him to die. When they finally emerged into the late afternoon sun, Tommy cried out and buried his face against Sam's shoulder. The boy hadn't seen daylight in God only knew how long. Sam carried him to Jasper, who stood patiently waiting, and lifted Tommy onto the saddle before mounting behind him. "We're going to town," Sam said, wrapping his arms protectively around the boy. "We're going to find out who did this to you, and we're going to make sure it never happens again." As they rode toward Tombstone, Sam noticed Tommy clutching something in his small fist, a piece of paper, crumpled and stained but carefully preserved. The boy had hidden it in his boot, pressed flat against his heel. When Sam asked about it, Tommy just shook his head and held it tighter. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when they reached the outskirts of town. Tombstone sprawled before them like a fever dream of civilization, false-fronted buildings, dusty streets, and the constant sound of hammers and saws as the town rebuilt itself after each boom and bust cycle. But as they rode down Fremont Street, Sam noticed something that made his blood run cold. People were staring, not with curiosity or concern, but with recognition and fear. At the Oriental saloon, a man in an expensive suit stepped onto the boardwalk and pointed directly at them. Sam recognized him immediately. Marcus Whitmore, superintendent of the Red Rock Consolidated mine, the same mine where Tommy had been imprisoned. "That's him!" Whitmore shouted to a gathering crowd. "That's the man who kidnapped the boy!" Sam felt Tommy stiffen in his arms as more men emerged from buildings along the street. These weren't curious townspeople. They were armed, organized, and moving with purpose. Sam's hand instinctively moved to the Colt, .45 on his hip, but he knew he was outnumbered 20-1. Sheriff Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. Sam had known Morrison for years, a decent enough lawman when the price was right, but everyone in Tombstone knew who really paid his salary. "Sam McKenna," Morrison called out, his hand resting on his gun butt, "I need you to dismount and hand over that boy. You're under arrest for kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Sam's voice carried the full weight of his disbelief and rage. "I found this child chained in a mine shaft like an animal. Look at his wrists, Morrison. Look at what they did to him." But the sheriff's eyes never left Sam's face. "The boy is property of Red Rock Consolidated, placed there for his own protection after he was caught sabotaging mine equipment. You had no right to remove him." The crowd murmured agreement, but Sam could see doubt in some faces. These were working men, many of them miners themselves. They knew the difference between justice and company policy. "Property?" Sam's voice rose. "He's a child, not a piece of equipment." Whitmore stepped forward, his smile cold as winter wind. "The boy is an apprentice miner, legally bound to the company under territorial law. His removal constitutes theft of company property and interference with lawful punishment." Tommy whimpered and pressed closer to Sam, his small body trembling with fear. In that moment, Sam understood the trap that had been set. They'd been waiting for someone to find the boy, waiting for someone to play the hero so they could be branded the villain. "There's going to be a town meeting at sunset," Morrison announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll sort this out proper-like, with witnesses and testimony. Until then, Mr. McKenna, you're free to go, but the boy stays in town custody." "Like hell he does," Sam growled, his hand moving closer to his gun. The crowd tensed, and Sam could feel the situation spiraling toward violence. But then Tommy shifted in his arms and pressed the crumpled paper into Sam's palm. When their eyes met, the boy mouthed a single word: evidence. Sam looked down at the paper and felt his world shift. It was a torn page from a ledger, covered in neat handwriting and official stamps. Even in the fading light, he could make out columns of numbers, initials, and something that made his blood freeze. An assay office stamp that had no business being on a payroll sheet. "Sunset," Sam said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. "I'll be there." As he rode away from the crowd, Tommy still in his arms, Sam knew they had maybe 2 hours before the trap closed completely. 2 hours to unravel a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Tombstone's power structure. 2 hours to save not just Tommy, but possibly dozens of other children who'd disappeared into the desert's hungry darkness. The sun continued its relentless march toward the horizon, and with each passing minute, Sam felt the weight of impossible odds pressing down on him. But he'd made a promise to a broken child, and Samuel McKenna had never broken a promise in his life. He wasn't about to start now. Sam guided Jasper through the back alleys of Tombstone, avoiding the main streets where Whitmore's men might be watching. Tommy remained silent in his arms, but Sam could feel the boy's tension. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow seemed to hold new terrors. They needed somewhere safe to examine the paper Tommy had risked everything to preserve. The old church at the end of Allen Street had seen better days. Its white paint was peeling, and the bell tower listed slightly to one side, but it still served the community as both house of worship and schoolhouse. More importantly, it was run by Margaret Sullivan, one of the few people in Tombstone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. Sam dismounted behind the church and helped Tommy down from the saddle. The boy's legs nearly buckled. Weeks of confinement had left him weak and unsteady. Sam caught him before he could fall, lifting him easily in his arms. "We're going to see Miss Margaret," Sam said softly. "She's a teacher, and she's good people. She'll help us figure out what that paper means." Tommy nodded but didn't speak. Sam had noticed that the boy seemed to retreat into himself whenever they approached other people, as if silence had become his only defense against a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. The back door of the church was unlocked. Margaret never worried about thieves in a building that contained nothing but Bibles and school supplies. Sam found her in the main room, grading papers by lamplight at a desk made from old packing crates. Margaret Sullivan was 35 years old and had never married, which made her an oddity in frontier society. She'd come west from Boston 5 years earlier with a teaching certificate and a determination to bring education to the children of the territory. What she'd found in Tombstone was a town where children often disappeared into the mines before they learned to read, and where asking too many questions could be hazardous to one's health. She looked up as Sam entered, her green eyes immediately focusing on the child in his arms. Margaret had seen enough mistreated children to recognize the signs, the way Tommy held himself, the fear in his eyes, the careful way he moved as if expecting pain. "Sam McKenna," she said, rising from her desk. "What have you brought me?" "Trouble," Sam replied honestly. "The kind that's going to get us all killed if we're not careful." He set Tommy down gently in one of the small chairs arranged around Margaret's desk. The boy immediately curled into himself, making himself as small as possible. Margaret knelt beside him, her voice soft and reassuring. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Margaret. You're safe here, I promise. No one is going to hurt you." Tommy looked up at her with eyes that had forgotten how to trust, but something in Margaret's manner seemed to reach him. He uncurled slightly, though he remained ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Sam pulled out the crumpled paper Tommy had given him and spread it carefully on Margaret's desk. The boy had this hidden in his boot. I think it might explain why someone wanted him to disappear. Margaret moved to the desk, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles as she examined the document. What she saw made her intake of breath sharp and angry. "This is a page from a company ledger," she said, her teacher's training evident in how quickly she processed the information. "But look at these entries. Apprentice wages for children who should be in school, not underground." Sam leaned over her shoulder, studying the neat columns of numbers and names. "What's this stamp here? Looks official." Margaret's face went pale. "That's an assay office stamp. It certifies the purity and value of precious metals. But why would it be on a payroll sheet?" Before Sam could answer, Tommy spoke for the first time since they'd entered the church. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words hit like thunder. "They made us sign papers. Said we were prentices, but we never got paid. Just food and a place to sleep." He paused, swallowing hard. "Sometimes not even that." Margaret knelt beside him again, her voice gentle but urgent. "Tommy, how many other children were there?" "6 when I got there. But some got sick and didn't get better. And Billy tried to run away, so they—" Tommy's voice broke, and he couldn't continue. Sam felt rage building in his chest like a physical force. "Where did you come from, son? How did you end up in that mine?" Tommy looked up at him with eyes far too old for his young face. "The train. The man said we were going to families who would take care of us. But when we got here, they took us to the mine instead." Margaret's face went white. "The orphan train? Dear God, they're intercepting children from the orphan train program." Sam had heard of the orphan trains, a well-meaning program that transported homeless children from eastern cities to families in the West. It was supposed to give children a chance at a better life, but like many good intentions, it had created opportunities for those with darker purposes. "The stamp?" Margaret said suddenly, pointing to the assay mark on the ledger page. "I know someone who might be able to tell us what this means. Daniel Kowalski runs the independent assay office on 4th Street. He's honest, and he knows every stamp and seal used in the territory." Sam checked his pocket watch. They had less than an hour before the town meeting, before Whitmore's trap closed around them. "Can we trust him?" "His brother died in a mine cave-in last year," Margaret said grimly. "A cave-in that happened because Red Rock Consolidated cut corners on safety equipment. Daniel has no love for the company." Sam made his decision. "Tommy, I need you to stay here with Miss Margaret. Can you do that for me?" The boy's eyes went wide with panic. "Don't leave me, please. They'll come for me." "No one's coming for you," Margaret said firmly, moving to a cabinet in the corner of the room. She pulled out an old shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. "I've been teaching school in frontier towns for 5 years, sweetheart. I know how to protect my students." Sam was surprised by the steel in the schoolteacher's voice. "You sure about this, Margaret? Those children on that ledger, some of them should have been in my classroom instead of underground in the dark." "Yes, I'm sure." Sam squeezed Tommy's shoulder gently. "I'll be back soon. And when I am, we're going to make sure the people who hurt you face justice." The boy nodded reluctantly, and Sam could see him drawing strength from Margaret's quiet confidence. As Sam headed for the door, Margaret called after him. "Sam, be careful. If they're willing to chain children in mine shafts, they won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens to expose them." Sam touched the brim of his hat. "I'll keep that in mind." The walk to Daniel Kowalski's assay office took Sam through the heart of Tombstone's business district. The streets were busier than usual. Word of the evening's town meeting had spread, and people were gathering in small groups, talking in hushed voices. Sam could feel eyes following him as he walked, and he noticed several men who looked like they might be carrying more than the usual frontier complement of weapons. Kowalski's office was a small, neat building wedged between a hardware store and a barber shop. Through the window, Sam could see the assayer bent over his workbench, examining ore samples under a magnifying glass. Daniel Kowalski was a thin, precise man in his 40s, with the careful manner of someone who dealt in exact measurements and absolute truths. Sam knocked on the door and was invited in. Kowalski looked up from his work, recognizing Sam immediately. "Mr. McKenna, I heard there was some excitement in town today. Something about you? And a missing child? That's part of why I'm here," Sam said, pulling out the ledger page. "I need you to look at this stamp and tell me what it means." Kowalski took the paper and examined it under his magnifying glass, his expression growing more puzzled by the moment. "This is very strange. This is definitely one of our official stamps. See the territorial seal and the registration number, but it's being used to authenticate a payroll document, not an ore sample. What would that accomplish?" "Well," Kowalski said slowly, "if someone wanted to make it appear that wages were being paid for legitimate mining work, an official stamp would lend credibility to the documentation. But more than that," he paused, studying the numbers more carefully. "These wage amounts, they're far below what any adult miner would accept. But if you were paying children, and only on paper," Sam felt the pieces clicking into place. "You're saying this is evidence of a fraud. They're claiming to pay wages to child workers, but the money's going somewhere else." "Exactly. And with an official assay stamp, they could present this to investors or territorial authorities as proof of legitimate operations." Kowalski's voice grew angry. "My brother died because they cut corners on safety equipment. If they're also using slave labor—" "Daniel," Sam said urgently, "I need you to come with me to the town meeting tonight. I need someone who can explain what this stamp means to people who might not understand the technical details." Kowalski looked at the ledger page again, then at Sam's determined face. "This is dangerous, you know. Whitmore has a lot of influence in this town. A child was chained in a mine shaft like an animal," Sam said quietly. "Other children have died. How much influence should that be worth?" Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, then began putting on his coat. "My brother always said that a man's character is measured by what he does when no one is watching. But sometimes, Mr. McKenna, it's measured by what he does when everyone is watching." As they left the assay office together, Sam felt a small spark of hope. They had evidence, they had an expert witness, and they had the truth. But as they walked toward the church to collect Margaret and Tommy, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that Whitmore had been planning this confrontation for a long time. The sun was sinking lower in the western sky, painting Tombstone's dusty streets in shades of gold and red. In less than an hour, Sam would face a hostile crowd and try to convince them that their town's most prominent businessman was a monster who trafficked in children's lives. The odds were still against them, but for the first time since he'd heard that desperate tapping in the mine shaft, Sam McKenna felt like they might have a fighting chance. The sun hung low over Tombstone like a bloody eye, casting long shadows across Fremont Street as people began gathering for the town meeting. Sam stood at the window of the church, watching the crowd assemble in the corral behind the Oriental saloon. What he saw made his stomach clench with dread. This wasn't the usual collection of curious townspeople who might attend a public meeting. These were hard men, mine supervisors, company guards, and drifters who worked for whoever paid best. They carried themselves with the easy confidence of people who expected violence and weren't troubled by the prospect. "How many do you count?" Margaret asked, joining him at the window. She'd traded her teacher's dress for practical riding clothes and had her shotgun slung across her shoulder. "Too many," Sam replied grimly, "and most of them are armed for more than conversation." Daniel Kowalski sat at Margaret's desk, carefully copying the information from Tommy's ledger page onto a clean sheet of paper. "If something happens to the original," he explained, "we'll still have the evidence." Tommy remained curled in his chair, but Sam noticed the boy was watching everything with sharp intelligence. Despite his ordeal, or perhaps because of it, Tommy understood that his survival might depend on what happened in the next hour. "There's something else," Tommy said, suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been earlier. "In the mine, I heard them talking. Mr. Whitmore and another man. They said something about a shipment coming in next week. More children." Margaret's face went white. "How many? 12? Maybe 15? They were arguing about where to put them all." Sam felt his resolve harden into something unbreakable. Whatever happened tonight, they had to stop Whitmore before more children disappeared into the darkness. A knock at the church door made them all freeze. Sam drew his Colt, motioning for the others to stay back as he approached the entrance. "Who is it?" "Frank Morrison." "I need to talk to you, Sam." Sam recognized the voice. Not Sheriff Jake Morrison, but his younger brother Frank, who worked as a blacksmith on Allen Street. Frank had always been the honest one in the Morrison family, which had caused considerable tension between the brothers over the years. Sam opened the door cautiously, keeping his gun ready. Frank stood alone on the church steps, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light. His leather apron was stained with soot and sweat from a day at the forge, and his face was grim. "Frank, what brings you here?" "Conscience, mostly," Frank replied, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Can I come in? There are things you need to know before you walk into that meeting." Sam stepped aside, and Frank entered the church. When he saw Tommy, the big blacksmith's face went pale. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "Is that the boy from the mine?" "His name is Tommy," Margaret said firmly. "And yes, he's the child your brother wants to hand back to the people who chained him underground." Frank knelt beside Tommy's chair, his voice gentle despite his intimidating size. "Son, I'm sorry for what happened to you, and I'm sorry my brother isn't doing his job." Tommy studied Frank's face carefully, then nodded slightly. It was the first sign of trust he'd shown to anyone except Sam and Margaret. Frank stood and turned to Sam. "You need to know what you're walking into. This isn't a town meeting. It's a trial, and the verdict's already been decided. Whitmore's been spreading money around all afternoon, buying testimony and loyalty." "What kind of testimony?" Daniel asked. "They've got 3 miners ready to swear that Tommy was caught sabotaging equipment in the East Drift. They're claiming he caused the cave-in that killed my brother and 2 other men." Sam felt his anger flare. "That's impossible. Tommy's just a child, and he was chained in that shaft for weeks. I know that, and you know that, but Whitmore's got witnesses who will say otherwise. He's also got the sheriff ready to arrest you for kidnapping the moment you show your face." Margaret stepped forward, her teacher's instincts taking over. "Frank, what really happened to your brother?" "The truth." Frank's massive hands clenched into fists. "Company ordered him to use cheap blasting powder and defective drill bits to save money. The charges didn't go off clean and the whole drift came down, but the official report blamed sabotage by unknown parties. And now they're blaming Tommy," Sam said, understanding the cruel logic of Whitmore's plan. "They need a scapegoat for the cave-in, and a child who can't defend himself is perfect. There's more," Frank continued. "Whitmore's not just planning to discredit you. He's planning to disappear you. After the meeting, when you're officially branded a kidnapper and a troublemaker, you'll have an accident on the way out of town." The church fell silent except for the sound of wind rattling the windows. Sam had expected opposition, but the scope of Whitmore's plan was breathtaking in its ruthlessness. "Why are you telling me this?" Sam asked. Frank's voice was heavy with pain and regret. "Because my brother died for Whitmore's greed, and now Jake's helping cover it up. Because there are children being hurt, and I've got a daughter of my own. Because sometimes a man has to choose between his family and his conscience." "And you're choosing conscience?" "I'm choosing to do what my brother would have done if he was still alive." Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of bent metal. "This is the drill bit that caused the cave-in. I pulled it out of the rubble myself. See how the threads are stripped? This bit was used far beyond its safe limits, but the company kept using it anyway." Daniel took the drill bit and examined it under his magnifying glass. "This is criminal negligence. No competent mining operation would use equipment in this condition." "That's not all," Frank said. He pulled out a small notebook, its pages stained with soot and sweat. "My brother kept records of every safety violation he witnessed. Dates, times, witnesses. He was planning to take it to the territorial authorities." Margaret took the notebook and began reading, her expression growing more horrified with each page. "Frank, this documents dozens of violations, unsafe working conditions, child labor, falsified safety reports, and now you know why they killed him," Frank said simply. Sam felt the weight of revelation settling over him. This wasn't just about Tommy or even about the other children in the mines. This was about a systematic pattern of corruption and murder that reached into every level of Tombstone's power structure. "Frank," Sam said carefully, Are you willing to testify to this at the meeting? The blacksmith's laugh was bitter. Testify? Sam, they're not planning a trial. They're planning an execution. The moment you walk into that corral, you're a dead man. Then what do you suggest? Frank was quiet for a moment, staring at the evidence spread across Margaret's desk. When he spoke, his voice was determined. We don't go to them. We make them come to us. And we make sure the whole town sees what really happened. What do you mean? Shift change is at 7 o'clock. 200 miners will be coming up from the underground workings, tired and angry about another day of dangerous conditions and short pay. They'll be walking right past the corral where Whitmore's holding his meeting. Margaret caught on immediately. If we could get their attention, show them the evidence. Miners stick together, Frank said. They know the difference between a company lie and the truth. And they know what happened to my brother could happen to any of them. Sam looked at Tommy, who had been listening to everything with the intense focus of a child who understood that his life hung in the balance. Tommy, Sam said gently, are you strong enough to tell your story to a crowd of people? It might be scary, but it could help save other children. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, then nodded with a determination that broke Sam's heart. If it helps the others, I'll do it. Daniel finished copying the ledger information and looked up at the group. We have evidence of fraud, child labor, safety violations, and murder, but we need to present it in a way that people can understand quickly. Leave that to me, Margaret said, her teacher's training evident. I know how to explain complex information to people who might not have much formal education. Frank checked his pocket watch. We have 20 minutes before shift change. If we're going to do this, we need to move now. Sam holstered his gun and picked up Tommy, wrapping the boy in his coat. Then let's go show Tombstone what kind of man Marcus Whitmore really is. As they prepared to leave the church, Sam caught Margaret's eye. You know this is dangerous. You don't have to— Mr. McKenna, Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down unruly students and hostile school boards. I became a teacher because I believe children deserve protection and education, not exploitation and abuse. Tonight, I'm going to teach this town a lesson they'll never forget. The sun was almost touching the western mountains as they stepped out into the gathering darkness. In the distance, they could hear the sound of the mine whistle signaling the end of the day shift. Soon, the streets would be filled with tired, angry miners, men who had seen too much death and too little justice. Tonight, Sam McKenna and his unlikely allies would gamble everything on the hope that truth could triumph over corruption, and that ordinary people would choose courage over comfort when faced with the reality of evil in their midst. The trap was about to spring, but not in the way Marcus Whitmore had planned. The mine whistle's long, mournful blast echoed across Tombstone as 200 miners began their weary trek up from the underground workings. Sam stood with his allies in the shadow of the assay office, watching the streams of lamp-lit figures emerge from the Red Rock Consolidated shaft like souls climbing out of purgatory. These were hard men, carved from desert stone and mining accidents, their faces permanently etched with dust and determination. They walked with the careful gait of people who had learned that the ground beneath their feet could never be trusted, and their eyes held the wariness of men who knew that each day underground might be their last. There, Frank Morrison pointed to a group of older miners walking together. Those are the shift supervisors. If we can convince them, the others will listen. Sam adjusted his hold on Tommy, feeling the boy's thin frame trembling with exhaustion and fear. They'd been moving for the past 20 minutes, positioning themselves along the miners' route home, and Tommy was reaching the end of his strength. You're doing great, son, Sam whispered. Just a little longer. Margaret stood beside them, her shotgun hidden beneath a long coat, but ready for use. In her other hand, she carried the evidence they'd gathered, the ledger page, Frank's brother's notebook, and Daniel's expert analysis of the fraudulent assay stamp. Remember, she said quietly, we need to get their attention quickly and present the facts clearly. These men are tired, and they won't have patience for a long explanation. Daniel Kowalski checked his pocket watch. The town meeting starts in 10 minutes. Whitmore will be expecting you to show up and walk into his trap. Let him wait, Sam said grimly. We're going to give him a different kind of surprise. The first group of miners was approaching their position when a commotion erupted from the direction of the Oriental saloon. Torches blazed to life around the corral, and they could hear Marcus Whitmore's voice carrying across the evening air. "Citizens of Tombstone, we gather tonight to address a grave threat to our community." Frank spat into the dust. "He's starting without you, probably hoping to get the crowd worked up before you have a chance to defend yourself." Sam made his decision. "Then we stop waiting and start acting. Frank, can you get those miners' attention?" The big blacksmith stepped into the street and raised his voice in a bellow that could be heard 3 blocks away. "Hold up there, boys. You need to hear this before you go home to your families." The miners stopped, turning toward Frank with expressions of curiosity and respect. Frank Morrison was known as an honest man who spoke his mind, and his brother's recent death had earned him sympathy throughout the mining community. "What's on your mind, Frank?" called out Pete Kowalski, Daniel's cousin and a shift supervisor with 20 years of underground experience. Frank gestured toward Sam and the others. "This here's Sam McKenna, and he's got something to show you that concerns every man who goes down in those shafts." Sam stepped forward, still carrying Tommy. The miners' expressions changed when they saw the boy. These were men with children of their own, and they could recognize suffering when they saw it. "This is Tommy Brennan," Sam said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "I found him this afternoon, chained in an abandoned mine shaft like an animal. He's been there for weeks, along with other children who were supposed to be apprentice miners." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. Pete Kowalski stepped closer, his weathered face grim. "Chained? What kind of man chains a child?" "The kind who's been lying to all of you about what really happened in the East Drift," Frank said, pulling out his brother's notebook. "The kind who's been using children as slave labor while claiming they're legitimate employees." Margaret stepped forward, her teacher's instincts taking over. "Gentlemen, I know you're tired and want to get home to your families, but this concerns your safety and the safety of every child in Tombstone." She held up the ledger page, making sure everyone could see it. "This document shows that Red Rock Consolidated has been falsifying payroll records, claiming to pay wages to child workers while actually pocketing the money. They've been using an official assay stamp to make the fraud appear legitimate." Daniel joined her, his technical expertise lending credibility to their claims. "I can verify that this stamp is genuine, but it's being used fraudulently. The wage amounts listed are far below what any adult miner would accept, and the work assignments match areas where we know safety violations have occurred." From the direction of the Oriental saloon, Whitmore's voice grew louder and more agitated. "The kidnapper McKenna refuses to face justice. He holds an innocent child hostage while spreading lies about honest businessmen." Pete Kowalski's face darkened. "Sounds like Whitmore's telling a different story. How do we know who's telling the truth?" Tommy stirred in Sam's arms, lifting his head to look at the assembled miners. When he spoke, his young voice carried clearly in the evening air. "I know some of you," he said, his words gaining strength as he continued. "You're Mr. Peterson. You gave me water once when I was working in the lower tunnel. And you're Mr. Garcia. You tried to help when I got hurt, but the foreman said to leave me alone." The miners exchanged glances, and Sam could see recognition dawning on several faces. These men had seen Tommy and the other children working underground, but they'd been told to mind their own business. "The boy's right," said a grizzled miner named Peterson. "I seen him and others down in the deep workings. Thought it was strange, but the supervisor said they were legitimate apprentices." "Apprentices don't get chained up," another miner called out, "and they don't work the dangerous areas where grown men won't go." Frank seized the moment, holding up the bent drill bit that had killed his brother. "This is what caused the cave-in that killed 3 good men. Company equipment used past its safe limits because Whitmore wanted to save money, and now he's trying to blame it on sabotage by children." The crowd's mood was shifting, anger replacing confusion as the miners began to understand the scope of the deception. These were men who risked their lives every day for honest wages, and the idea that their safety was being compromised for profit struck at the core of their beliefs. "Where are the other children?" Pete Kowalski demanded. "If what you're saying is true, there should be more of them." Tommy's voice was barely a whisper, but in the desert silence, Everyone heard him. Some got sick and died. Others, they're still down there, in the hoist house. There's a locked room. The miners erupted in angry voices, but their fury was directed not at Sam and his allies, but at the realization that they'd been working alongside enslaved children while their supervisors looked the other way. "We need to see this room," Peterson declared. "If there are children being held prisoner, we need to know about it." From the Oriental saloon, they could hear Whitmore's voice becoming more desperate. "Where is McKenna? He promised to face justice, but like all cowards, he runs when confronted with his crimes." Frank grinned fiercely. "I think it's time we crashed Whitmore's party. What do you say, boys? Want to hear what our mine superintendent has to say when he's faced with the truth?" The miners responded with a roar of approval that echoed off the surrounding buildings. As one, the crowd began moving toward the Oriental saloon, their anger building with each step. Sam found himself at the center of a human tide of righteous fury, still carrying Tommy, but now surrounded by protectors instead of enemies. Margaret walked beside him, her shotgun no longer hidden, while Daniel and Frank flanked them with grim determination. As they approached the corral behind the Oriental, they could see the torchlit gathering that Whitmore had assembled. Company men, hired guns, and a few townspeople who'd been bought or intimidated into attendance. Sheriff Jake Morrison stood beside Whitmore, his hand resting on his gun butt. But the balance of power was shifting dramatically. What had been planned as a kangaroo court was about to become a public reckoning, with 200 angry miners serving as judge and jury. Whitmore saw them coming and his face went pale. "Sheriff Morrison, arrest that man immediately." But Jake Morrison was looking at the approaching crowd of miners, men who represented the real economic power of Tombstone, and his hand moved away from his gun. Whatever Whitmore was paying him, it wasn't enough to face down 200 angry workers. "Marcus Whitmore!" Frank Morrison's voice boomed across the corral. "These men want to hear you explain why children were chained in your mine shafts." The crowd of company supporters began to melt away as the miners surrounded the corral. Faced with overwhelming numbers and undeniable evidence, Whitmore's carefully planned trap was collapsing around him. "This is all lies!" Whitmore shouted desperately. "McKenna is a kidnapper and a troublemaker. The boy is a saboteur who caused the deaths of good men." Tommy lifted his head from Sam's shoulder and looked directly at Whitmore. When he spoke, his young voice carried the weight of absolute truth. "You told me my parents were dead and nobody wanted me. You said if I didn't work, you'd throw me in the desert for the coyotes. You said nobody would ever believe a worthless orphan over a respectable businessman." The corral fell silent except for the crackling of torches and the whisper of desert wind. In that silence, the truth hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore or deny. Pete Kowalski stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Whitmore, I think it's time you showed us that locked room in the hoist house." "I don't know what you're talking about," Whitmore stammered, but his eyes betrayed his fear. "Then you won't mind if we take a look," Frank said. "Boys, what do you say we go check on our fellow workers?" The crowd surged toward the mine complex, carrying Sam and his allies along like driftwood in a flood. Whitmore tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The miners had surrounded him completely. At the hoist house, it took the miners less than 5 minutes to locate the hidden room. When they broke down the door, they found 4 more children, all bearing the same brass tags as Tommy, all showing signs of malnutrition and abuse. The sight of those children, some barely older than 8 or 9, broke whatever restraint the miners had been showing. Whitmore found himself facing a wall of angry faces, and even his hired guns were backing away from the confrontation. "String him up!" someone shouted, but Pete Kowalski raised his hand for silence. "No," he said firmly. "We're not murderers, but we're also not going to let this stand." He turned to Sheriff Morrison, who had been conspicuously silent throughout the confrontation. "Jake, you've got a choice to make. You can arrest Whitmore for what he's done to these children, or you can explain to 200 miners why you're protecting a man who enslaves kids." Morrison looked at Whitmore, then at the crowd of angry miners, then at the rescued children who represented evidence that couldn't be denied or explained away. When he spoke, his voice was resigned. Marcus Whitmore, you're under arrest for child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As Morrison placed Whitmore in shackles, the mine superintendent's composure finally cracked completely. You don't understand? The investors demanded higher profits. I was just trying to meet their expectations. By enslaving children? Margaret's voice cut through his protests like a blade. By chaining them underground like animals? Whitmore had no answer for that, and his silence spoke louder than any confession. As the crowd began to disperse, Sam found himself standing with Tommy and the other rescued children, surrounded by people who had chosen courage over comfort, truth over convenience. The trap that had been set for him had instead caught the real criminals, and justice, real justice, was finally being served. Tommy looked up at Sam with eyes that were beginning to remember how to hope. What happens now? Sam knelt beside the boy, his voice gentle but firm. Now, we make sure this never happens again. We find good families for you and the other children, families who will treat you the way kids should be treated. And we make sure the people responsible face the full consequences of what they've done. Margaret joined them, her teacher's instincts already working on the practical details. I know several families in town who would be honored to provide homes for these children. Real homes, with love and education, and the chance to be kids again. Frank Morrison approached, his massive frame somehow gentle as he knelt beside the children. My wife and we've been talking about taking in an orphan. If any of you would like a home with a blacksmith's family, you'd be welcome. One by one, the miners and townspeople stepped forward, offering homes and hope to children who had known only darkness and despair. It wasn't charity, it was community, the kind of mutual support that made frontier life possible. As the sun finally disappeared behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Sam McKenna stood in the middle of Tombstone's main street and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a job well done. Tommy tugged at his sleeve. Mr. Sam, will you visit me sometimes? At my new family? Sam smiled, the first genuine smile he'd worn in longer than he could remember. Son, you couldn't keep me away if you tried. We're partners now, you and me. Partners look out for each other. The boy smiled back, and in that moment Sam understood that he'd found something more valuable than silver or gold. He'd found purpose and hope and the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win. The town that had set a trap before dark had instead freed itself from the darkness that had been growing in its heart. And the man they'd once called the Lonely Rancher discovered that he wasn't alone after all. In Tombstone, Arizona territory, justice had finally come home. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.